Hello all, and welcome to the 13th episode of the Smoky Scale. Today we will be reviewing Ballads 1, the first studio album created by Joji and published by 88 Rising. Back in 2020, with the 4th episode of the series, I reviewed his second studio album, Nectar. In that review, I gave the album a 65% because of how incohesive and directional it felt, making me wonder at the end why there were so many songs that felt unfinished or were poor quality overall compared to the singles for the album. With Ballads 1, I wanted to give it a full re-listen for a Smoky Scale shortly after the Nectar review was released, so here it is. Starting off with the first track, Attention, a nice lo-fi piano track could be heard in the background, which repeats throughout the song. Joji has low-tone vocals on this track, which is pretty much what I expect from him at this point. This song is, in my opinion, a perfect example of Joji's branch into music, which is straight lo-fi. It makes for a slow, simple, but nice entry into the album and into the next track, Slow Dancing in the Dark. Attention gets a 7 out of 10. Slow Dancing in the Dark is one of Joji's most popular songs for a reason, and perfectly encapsulates what Ballads 1 and Joji is, way more than Attention did, which is speaking about his feelings and emotions surrounding the heavy topic of love. With some of his best vocals on a track yet, and a chilled out background tone, this is definitely one of the tracks that make this album. Slow Dancing in the Dark gets a 10 out of 10. Test Drive is another one of my favorite tracks off of Ballads 1, keeping a similar and chill vibe that continues from the previous tracks. While it is still a good track, it also keeps that same repetitive beat in the background of the track, which almost feels samey going 3 tracks in at this point. I give Test Drive an 8 out of 10. Wanted You is a nice track, keeping the same repetitive nature of the songs once again. It is one of the more lo-fi tracks on the album, but it has heavier vocals than some other tracks as well from Joji. The short guitar solo at the end is neat though, but it still feels samey to me. Wanted You gets a 6 out of 10. Can't Get Over You is also another personal favorite track off the album, even though it has most of the negatives I've criticized so far, which was being repetitive and feeling samey to the other tracks in this album. This one is shorter though, so I think it's better that way if I were to go re-listen to this song some other time. Can't Get Over You gets a 7 out of 10. Yeah Right is a less repetitive song on this album, which makes it another favorite of mine off Ballads 1. The little drops where the beat changes make the song much better than it would be without them. I give Yeah Right an 8 out of 10. Why Am I Still in LA has a very different tone and reminds of certain tracks off of Nectar. However, at a certain point, the guitar solo becomes ear-crushing, which is unfortunate because this song is a nice listen otherwise. However, if you like it, more to you. Why Am I Still in LA gets a 5 out of 10. No Fun also has a very different tone, and is more of a pop song compared to the first half of Ballads 1. It is very simple, like pretty much every song on this album, but it would be a nice song to listen to on a drive home or something like that. No Fun gets a 6 out of 10. Now at this point in Ballads 1, there are only 4 more tracks left, and most of them are not very notable compared to the tracks reviewed in the album already, so I will be reviewing the rest in this new segment of the Smoky Scale called The Extras Reel. Come Through is a neat little lo-fi song with some pretty vocals from Joji himself, making another enjoyable song without much complaint. Come Through gets a 7 out of 10. R.I.P. featuring Triple Red is a really good track to this album that I think is somewhat underrated. With a lot more variation in tone and vocals, it's become one of my personal faves of Ballads 1. R.I.P. gets a 9 out of 10. XNXXX is yet another short and simple track to the album that is very enjoyable, but falls through with being a little too repetitive like other tracks in Ballads 1. XNXX gets a 6 out of 10. I'll See You in 40 being the final track on this album. How does it handle? Well, it's definitely a pretty good ending track to this album with some nice variation in beat, vocal range, and instrumentation. I'd even go to say that this one is underrated, similarly like R.I.P. I'll See You in 40 gets a 9 out of 10. Since I've reviewed everything there is to review about Ballads 1, let's get into my gripe with the album. As I've reviewed every song in Ballads 1, there is a clear reminder that this is Joji's first album, given just how repetitive and simple it is. But the big point I don't like about it is how repetitive it just is, with a lot of the tracks feeling samey and even some feeling like repeats of each other. With Nectar, it is still clear that Joji is set on making repetitive tracks. However, most of this complaint has faded by then due to the experimentation done within that album. But that doesn't mean the criticism is gone or invalid because it's still clearly somewhat of a problem. I think having a few songs in the album that are repetitive is fine and good, but most of these songs are not just a few, and it brings down this album for me somewhat even for what I found good about it. Overall, the total score of Ballads 1 is brought down by 5%. Speaking of the total score, let's go check it out. With 12 songs being in Ballads 1, what is the verdict of this album? Ballads 1 gets an official score of 70% on the Smoky scale, 5% higher than Nectar. If the album was less repetitive and samey, I would have placed it higher, but that's not the case. Anyways, remember to subscribe, come back for the 14th episode of the Smoky Scale and more videos in the future. That's about it. See ya.